I'm Sarah Rogers. I'm a founding board member and director at the American Society of Pharmacovigilance, where I lead the educational, clinical, and research initiatives for the society. Also from ASP, we have Ben Brown, who serves as the society's executive director. Ben and I lead the collaborative community efforts for ASP, and we're excited to be here today to tell you more about the community and the opportunity that we all have to advance pharmacogenomics through this collaborative forum. And when we started ASP, the goal was to develop a network of healthcare professionals who are committed to improving the quality of patient care and to create a platform to fight the good fight against the fourth leading cause of death in the US, which is alarmingly adverse drug events. That said, many of our organizational objectives are centered around precision medicine and leveraging tools like pharmacogenetics testing to optimize medication management and avoid ADEs. One of ASP's initiatives is called the Stripe Collaborative Community, and it's an initiative that we continue to develop alongside many stakeholders in PGX with the goal of better understanding and further defining challenges in the space, and then working together to address those challenges in new and innovative ways, as well as supporting existing efforts. The impetus for forming the Stripe community was, among other things, the recent changes to the regulatory landscape for pharmacogenetics testing, which concern not only members within ASP, but also the larger pharmacogenomics community. What spurred the FDA safety communications? What does this mean for PGX, and how do we move forward? Questions we believed could not be answered without a concerted and dedicated effort to fully understand the existing and unique challenges that each healthcare sector faces as they develop, implement, and interpret tests. The Stripe initiative launched last fall, and through a series of open calls and feedback from stakeholders, produced a charter. And that charter was signed by nearly 100 founding members across 15 different healthcare sectors. One of the cornerstones to the collaborative community framework is that members agree to secure buy-in on the direction of Stripe to ensure that anything produced through the community also meets the needs of the stakeholder groups they represent. The charter was also submitted to the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, who set a strategic priority to participate in collaborative communities for medical devices. Part of that determination is based on potential impact that a given community has on the public health. There are only 6 collaborative communities with CDRH participation, including ophthalmic imaging, real-world evidence, liquid biopsy, case for quality, artificial intelligence, and now pharmacogenetics testing. So it's a tremendous opportunity for the entire field to have this forum and really open the lines of communications across stakeholder groups, including the FDA. Today's discussion is the first of what we believe will be many opportunities for the Stripe community to bring important issues in PGX to the forefront and pursue actionable ways to address them. We're joined by 3 community members who are not only leaders within the Stripe community, but also nationally renowned leaders in precision medicine, who will talk a bit about the challenges and opportunities that would be better faced together. With that, I'll pass it over to Ben to introduce today's panelists and get the discussion started.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for that. And with us today, allow me to introduce 3 close colleagues and members of the Stripe Steering Committee so we can get going with our discussion. First, Christine Ashcraft, who many of you know, is a molecular biologist by training and is the former CEO and founder of Uscript, recently acquired by Invitae. She has worked in pharmacogenomics since 2000 and was recently named one of the 25 leading voices in precision medicine. Christine has authored multiple publications on the clinical and economic benefits of pharmacogenomic testing, including one lauded as the most influential publications at the American Medical Informatics Association meeting. Next, we have Burns Blaxel, who is the founding director of precision medicine at the Christ Hospital Health Network. He leads efforts to transition from reactive to proactive healthcare delivery by harnessing the power of personal diagnostic and genomic data, using approaches ranging from cutting-edge hereditary disease risk assessment, genetic counseling and testing to pharmacogenomics and genome-guided clinical care pathways. Precision medicine at the Christ Hospital Health Network aims to provide proactive, individualized clinical care for every patient. And Jamie Elliott, who is clinical business strategy team within Thermo Fisher Scientific's Genetic Sciences Division, where he directs new platform and test development for diagnostic segments. Jamie is actively involved in CE, in vitro diagnostic and US in vitro diagnostic strategy development, as well as programs focused on pharmacogenetics-enabled medication therapy management, reimbursement, and regulatory strategy. All right, guys, thank all of you for joining us today. And let's just jump right in with a question I usually like to ask, which is, what's an important event in the history of PGX that seems like not that many people are familiar with? Be curious to get your guys' take.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for me, it wasn't, say, an event in a single day sense, but I think in the definition that we've understood historically of precision medicine, it is almost always thought in the context of oncology and next-gen sequencing. And what that event occurred really between 2010 and 2014. And the event I'm talking about is the immense ramp that we saw, largely because of the lack of a lot of the structure we'll talk today about in PGX testing that really dwarfed any other precision medicine segment. For me, that period was immensely informative. We'll talk about that today, but it's we talk about it as in an after fact kind of sense. But during that time, I can say from my vantage point from Thermo Fisher Scientific, in 2014 we processed, our technologies processed over 3 million samples. And I think across other technology providers, there would be quite a few, far greater number of samples. And so that period to me was incredibly important. It was kind of my education in all of the gaps that we'll talk about in the PGX segment. But it largely went unrecognized and largely misunderstood in the larger precision medicine community.
I think, Ben, we've spoken previously about how I became interested in pharmacogenomics during my training in the mid-90s. There were many trials being done on beta blockers, and one of them called bucindolol had failed in the clinical trial space. But in the group that I was training with in Colorado, we and they had gone back and found that with genetic testing, there was two very distinct groups of responders and non-responders. And at the time, a company was started to try to market this drug with a companion diagnostic test. And in the mid-90s, that was a failed enterprise, because why would you do that? But now we're in the 2020s, and that's 25 years later, and we're still trying to get pharmacogenomics off the ground. But I think there's a much greater appetite for it in the community now that everyone has done a 23andMe or an Ancestry.com and found out, maybe who their dad isn't or how they taste cilantro. But they're also gaining an appetite for understanding their health from a more genomic perspective. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to make inroads on improving pharmaceutical prescription as long as we implement correctly. And I think that's our greatest challenge. How about you, Christine?
Oh, it is so hard. There are so many things. I think that the biggest thing that I think of, and I've already mentioned it, but I think it is not as well understood for those of us that have been able to avoid drug development guidance of the FDA. But I think one thing that's super key is that for decades, the FDA has stated that drug-gene significant interactions are the equivalent of drug-drug interactions. So they have these drugs that are potent inhibitors of the same cytochromes that they tell drug developers to use to essentially phenoconvert patients to core metabolizers. So they have used this in drug development guidance for decades, and it is standard of care to have drug-drug interaction alerts flag in health systems, but we don't do the same for drug-gene. And I think it's a huge disconnect, and more people need to be aware of that.
To take that and kind of bring that forward, I'm curious, Christine, while we have you, what's your perception of what's changed the most in the field of PGX in the last 12 months?
12 months. I think the biggest change in my mind is that there has been huge advances in coverage. So it started with United Healthcare dramatically expanding access for patients, unfortunately, that had failed first-line anxiety or depression treatment, but they at least covered a multi-gene panel for mental health patients, not segregated to a specific laboratory, for expanding that coverage. And then more recently, a number of Medicare MACs have implemented local coverage determinations that dramatically expand coverage, including covering multi-gene panels if 2 genes are of concern for either the medications already prescribed or under consideration. And although not perfect, I think both of those are a huge step in the right direction. I will say 20 years in this space, one of the biggest pushbacks we would get is, well, it's not covered, or it's not covered very often. It's very, very hard to talk a physician or a health system into implementing precision medicine when the reimbursement is such a barrier.
What's your take, Jamie?
Yeah, I would echo Christine's comments, and I would also say that the FDA's recent movement and acknowledgement of high evidence markers for PGX testing, and also giving some nod to how reporting might be done safely is also important. I think that a misunderstanding is that oftentimes is that the regulatory bodies are all aligned, or at least the governmental bodies are aligned in their thinking, and they're oftentimes not. I'm sure because it's a busy and crowded space there. But safety is really important, and how the FDA perceives safety and how they acknowledge safe use is equally as important as coverage. And we saw that in hiccups over the last several years, where we had labs deploying and being reimbursed, but we had, some punitive measures, or at least some measures by the FDA because of lack of alignment in some of the issues of what can be reported on and how will it be reported. I would also say that the formation of the STRIPE initiative is important, because the FDA is acknowledging, in fact, that this is an area that they want to solve for. So taken together with Christine's comment, I think we're starting to see some harmonization and collective effort in trying to solve this problem.
Burns, how about you? Thanks, Jamie.
I would probably just dovetail with both those comments. If I could take it outside of the 12-month scenario, 15 months ago, the FDA took a very dramatic action that Jamie was just kind of alluding to, where they said, you can't play in this sandbox on both sides of the team. And reporting is key, and it needs to be a true clinical decision support. And so there were, as he mentioned, kind of punitive measures. But what's really nice, and then to dial forward to what is happening with us as a group, is that the FDA is, I guess I would say, admitting that they would like our guidance, and also willing to participate in accepting that guidance. So what's been exciting over the past, decade and a half is that groups such as the Clinical Pharmacogenomics Implementation Consortium, CPIC, and the FDA and other groups have all come up with their ideas of what is the right way to implement pharmacogenomics and how restrictive or broad those should be. And I would say that the exciting part of the STRIPE collaborative is it's going to bring all those groups into one room to try and ultimately identify what the guidance should be. Because right now, each group has a different idea on how we implement. There's different coverages offered through payers, and Medicare has mentioned previously, has implemented differently in different areas of the country and different MACs. So I think this initiative is really a very significant one, because it's bringing all of those disparate groups to the table, like Jamie mentioned, and hopefully will allow us to harmonize what the recommendations will be, so that we can best protect patients. And Christine's excellent presentation earlier in her keynote, she talked about how this is such an impact on our society, that it's the greatest cost to our healthcare system, more than any other single disease by more than double. So we need to address this. And I think this is, for me, this is a very exciting initiative for us to bring all the players to the table, show the cards, and see how we play.
And, based on what you said, I'm curious, Like, what's your perception of some of the key aspects of those regulatory challenges that Stripe seeks to address, and some that stakeholders might not be familiar with, that this is the first time they're hearing about Stripe?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think many people are not aware of is that there really are no clearly accepted guidelines by an overarching governing body. So CPIC has great guidelines. They're fairly restrictive, but to my knowledge, there's no payer that says we'll pay for the CPIC guidelines. Right now, you have United who will pay for after first failure of antidepressant, which, I think is a great move. I was actually sitting next to folks from United when they announced this, and I said, well, I'm in the cardiology world, so we don't really cover after first failure of heart transplant. And of course, they said, Burns, we're moving in the right direction. Give us a little bit of slack. But I think it's important that we recognize that this is a process to move forward and to harmonize. So one thing people may not be aware of is that there are no real clear guidelines of what the clinical decision support recommendations should be, what genes should be tested, what drugs should be involved. And there have been disparate groups, and hopefully all of them being at the table now, from payers to providers to labs to clinical decision support tools, can all come together with the patient's best interest and give that clinical decision support. So did that answer your question? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that was great, Burns. I'm curious what take Jamie or Christine might have on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Burns' thoughts and add more to it. If you think of it as an ecosystem, and I always like to think of it from the standpoint of a laboratorian, because ultimately these tests are run in laboratories. We have different views, I think, depending on our perspective of what a laboratory or a laboratorian looks like, or what, how PGX is deployed. The interesting vantage point that I'm fortunate to have from a Thermo Fisher Scientific, perspective is that we get to see kind of all the labs, right? We get to interact with lots of different folks. And so I think of this ecosystem really and what's required as a set of solutions that Stripe could advise on, or a knowledge base to solve some of the gaps in the regulatory environment that you're talking about. So it can be, what is the definition of a panel, right? And who acknowledges the value of that panel? Not just in terms of payment, but we also understand from FDA standpoint of what's safe. How is that panel validated, and what are the best practices? We could go into questions about. I think of PGX as one of many challenges that's evolved in the last 10 years, which is really challenges around panel-based content. So we think of the challenges in oncology or panel-based infectious disease testing, and PGX is kind of in that milieu. And so what would a PGX IVD initiative look like? How could we, what are the validation guidances that can be provided for LDTs, and what is a path forward for IVD, considering that a PGX panel could be prohibitively expensive to take through that process in kind of a traditional standpoint? Then there's a question of alignment to reporting, and how do both FDA and the payers, do they have input and perspective on reporting? So I think of it as a holistic process, and how do you align that? And then how do you make that information available to laboratorians who are not experts in drug metabolism? I think it's important to note that, at least in my experience of the customer base we were supporting, or at least engaging with, more than 2/3 were technically excellent at validating tests, but not necessarily experts in drug metabolism. So who do we think in the future should be running these tests? And that should guide the kinds of solutions that we endeavor to develop through Stripe.
Thanks, Jamie. Christine, what would you add to that?
I would add two things. One, I'd say there's creating those for laboratorians, but also for payers. If I had $1 for every time a payer said, can you tell me where I can go look to make sure that this lab is trustworthy and they have a good pharmacogenetic testing panel and report. And I think we're doing the industry a big service if we create a resource that makes it super easy for a payer to go, okay, they're on the list of approved labs that did all the right stuff so that I can pay them. Right now we have PharmGKB, we have CPIC, we have all AMP, we have all of these different initiatives, and they're all worthwhile and a lot of really smart people. We need to make it easy for a non-expert to come in and see exactly what good looks like and come to consensus on it. And sure, there may be better, but what is a minimum standard? Let's establish it and understand that we'll continue to evolve and make it easy for outsiders to understand what quality looks like. I'd say the second thing is interoperability. You know, these same pharmacogenomic genes are going to impact how you respond to medications the rest of your life. And I think there's a lot of research that's still going to continue to evolve, especially for transporters, receptors. But a lot of the metabolism information for the core cytochromes is reasonably well understood for the majority of the population right now. And so how do we push forward standards that make sure that instead of a PDF getting lost in the health record of the ordering provider, that information is pushed through discreetly, it's stored discreetly. We enable either state or nationwide repositories so that information can be shared. So if I were tested in Washington and I'm a snowbird that spends 6 months of the year in Florida, those results can easily follow me. These are the kind of things as an industry we have to address to make sure we put as big of a dent in that avoidable adverse drug event epidemic as possible.
Thank you. I think that really kind of segues perfectly into how is Stripe prepared and best suited to address and tackle these regulatory challenges versus some of these other organizations who have been working very hard and diligently for 20 years, but maybe individually might not. Individually, maybe weren't making the dent, or the progress that we believe maybe Stripe could make. So maybe we could get some perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think what Stripe is doing is allowing, a kind of a meeting ground for these groups to connect. Everyone's incredibly busy. And I think that without this type of activity, I don't know that well-intended folks would necessarily get together to try and solve this problem. So I think Stripe really just is allowing us to have that activation energy. And from the community members that I've interacted with so far, Ben, I mean, I think we have the right group of people and the ability to attract any others that might be missing to address the problems that we've just now started talking about.
Yeah, I think I agree. I would say that Stripe is a uniter, not a divider.
Right.
And the challenge that we have faced is that there have been local, national, and international organizations addressing this. And for example, the CPIC guidelines have been followed already for quite some time in many single-payer medical systems. I grew up in Canada, and other folks implement in Europe, and implementing pharmacogenomics in the ridiculous nature of what is the American medical system, to be perfectly honest, is far more difficult, and the regulatory hurdles are different. And so what Stripe is doing is taking these organizations that have had wonderful agendae to push things forward, to hopefully bring them all together and bring a loud enough voice to the FDA and to payers and providers to say that this is how it should be done. Because so far, pharmacogenomics has kind of been the little stepchild that you're told to run along and go play. And the reality is that our voice should be loud enough, since everything that we've been talking about today in this symposium is what impacts patient health more than any major disease entity on its own. So I think what it's really doing is just unifying us into a chorus of voices that have had maybe slightly different missions, and hopefully bringing us all together to really bring credibility. And fortunately, the FDA has agreed to come play with us.
Thank you, Burns. Christine, what would you add?
I think I think one of the things, in addition to the conversation with the FDA, is just the ability to elevate and educate. I know earlier in some of the presentations at the Precision Medicine Leaders Summit, Dr. Grilly, I think it was, from Mayo, he said, I realized that you don't want to be having conversations with the doctors that are high-fiving you and saying, pharmacogenomics, this is it. We need to figure out how to engage with the people that aren't the early adopters, that aren't the innovators. We need to move this from that part of the adoption curve over into the majority, because I truly believe that there's nothing we can do to have a more dramatic impact on patient safety where it comes to medication management than to improve the adoption of pharmacogenomics and optimize the clinical decision support system for medication management, and incorporate pharmacists more into medication management, including pharmacogenomics in care.
Yeah, so I would dovetail on what Christine said. I think the biggest challenge that will be tackled by Stripe and all of its members is that not only does pharmacogenomics mean slightly different things to different people, but the implementation of it is a completely foreign territory for a vast majority of hospital systems. And, for the major hospital medical center, for example, trying to get all of the physicians on board with checking their EMR every day to look at the drug-drug gene interactions is probably not going to happen. So some implementation science study around this is also very important for us to design. And that will, as Christine said, likely involve pharmacists and kind of mid-level providers playing a very key role in the implementation once we decide on what the regulatory support is.
And, and listening to you, it seems like each of you have been able to pull back the curtain on some specific issues or opportunities that the community is uniquely positioned to be able to address. And so maybe almost as a recap or an opportunity now, each of you could zero in and think of maybe what are some key issues that the Stripe community is uniquely positioned to take on. Kind of build on words that have been shared earlier during our call or during our meeting.
Well, I would be reiterating what I said earlier about the ecosystem, but I think it's, it kind of is what it is. To simply be able to build out a starting framework with the FDA that is a working system where we can begin a process of collating existing information, defining what has evidence for use, defining what should be safe and normative for reporting, safe and normative for laboratory deployment. This is huge. This is a conversation that we've not had access to with the FDA. And I think it's not just important for pharmacogenetics. I think when we look at omics in general and we think about oncology and we think of things like polygenic risk scores, these will all challenge, I think, the regulators in exactly the same way. I also think that the basis of this framework, because we've talked a lot about the collaborative community, or we're talking about the collaborative community, we're talking really about safety when we talk to the FDA. To Christine's earlier point, this framework should be extended to discussion to CMS and the payers, because the ecosystem doesn't work unless we have payment. We don't talk enough about it, I think, because it can be really uncomfortable or it's a hard thing to kind of orient around. But what makes these segments work is safe deployment and payer understanding about what should be paid for. And we should be joining these two conversations.
To add on to this, patient safety, that is the FDA's primary concern, patient safety when it comes to medication management. And when I think about pharmacogenomics and improved clinical decision support, I feel like we are telling people when we say focus on drug gene or wait until they fail, we're essentially providing seatbelts, but telling people only to wear them at certain times of the day or on certain roads, which doesn't make sense to me. Pharmacogenomics at the end of the day is, like a seatbelt, you should wear it all the time. You should integrate it to the system so that you can use it anytime a medication decision is made the rest of a patient's life. So you look at seatbelts, right? They save 15,000 lives a year in the United States. we would only have to prevent about 7% of deaths from adverse drug events in the United States to exceed the impact of seatbelts. Yet it is the law in most states. They've been mandated to be included in cars since the 60s. So I think there are certainly all of the conversations we've already talked about, but I think we really need to elevate the impact that pharmacogenomics and improved clinical decision support can have in patient safety, because I think it's significant, and really elevate the conversation higher in terms of how do we address this, not just at the individual level, but nationally.
I guess I would add another key component of what Stripe will do as a collaborative community is to get the message out past the choir.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now there's, 100 something people online listening to us, and we are the choir. And whether we like how we sing or not, we're singing. But the reality is we need to get that message out to those who don't hear us. And so one of the components of the Stripe community is both internal and external communications, and learning how to engage all of the parties involved, whether it's the payers, the employers, the providers, the patients, importantly. There's again, a renewed appetite on the behalf of patients for doing Ancestry.com or 23andMe for what we've discussed previously. But when you tell them, I'd like to do pharmacogenomics, they say, whoa, I don't know. I don't want you messing with my genes, and I don't want you, reducing my medical coverage because of a pre-existing condition. Mm-hmm. So another component of what we'll do, hopefully, is expand upon the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which still doesn't protect long-term care or disability. And patients still ask about that. And many patients will do pharmacogenomic testing as an out-of-pocket pay because they don't want their insurer to know. But that limits our ability to include that for the snowbirds who move from Seattle to Arizona, as Christine was talking about. So part of what we can do is, proselyte pharmacogenomics, I guess, is a word that you could use, but to really raise awareness that, and then lobby on behalf of it so that we can communicate the importance of it to all the involved parties, but also hopefully work with the FDA and ultimately Congress to get better protection for patients, because we are improving their health to a point that no matter what lobby comes in against the law, we will be saving more lives and money than any other company would make by preventing them by getting that insurance.
Burns, you gave us a really good opportunity to, try and look at this through another lens, and maybe collectively as a group, we could work towards maybe better defining what are some of the known barriers to the widespread adoption. We've been talking about some key issues that Stripe can address, but maybe we could zero in even more specifically on some known barriers to the widespread adoption that I think each of you individually have been working on professionally, but maybe we could use this as an opportunity to share those with the listeners so they could become more oriented to some of these barriers that we're seeking to break down and knock down with the community.
Well, I think we've talked about a number of them, but I think the foundational piece is really education. We need more patient education. We need more provider education. We need more payer education. We need more government education. And so, there's interoperability, there's aligning standards. All of those are important. But I think that the foundational element, to Burns' point, is making sure that we're able to preach well beyond the choir.
Yeah, Ben, you're probably not old enough to remember when the implementation of seatbelts happened, but
I met Ralph Nader. I know what he was up to back in the day.
Right, but I grew up in the era where where it was just a new regulation, and it took a long time to get used to putting on the seatbelt when you got in the car, and there were signs on roadways everywhere of click it or ticket and everything else, and it took a long time. So a really key component of what we're doing is just raising awareness. And that will have to be with constant messaging. And the same holds true for what Jamie was talking about with precision medicine and oncology. There are all sorts of drugs in oncology that you can prescribe if you have a known genetic mutation. And yet of all organizations to study this, and Christine actually shared this with me, Forbes of all people, I think it was you, Christine, Forbes of all magazines reported that less than 15% of patients who warranted precision diagnostics for oncology received it. And it's been around since, as Jamie was mentioning. So it takes a while. So we have to be relentless in our marketing and education efforts.
Burns, if it makes you feel any better, I remember before there were seatbelt laws. I would add, we don't want to homogenize the community or the strategic initiatives of the community around PGX, right? So classically, when we think about pharmacogenetics, I think about a couple different use cases that we've been speaking to mostly. An IDN that has a laboratory that wants to deploy within their hospital network, mostly reference laboratories, which were responsible for most of the volume deployment between 2010 and 2015. These are standalone reference laboratories that had some type of deployment modality, whether it's a Salesforce or what have you. And so the question we have to be really careful of when we talk about barriers are who are we solving for? Ben, you've heard me talk about this in terms of what framework are we trying to solve for? I think that's critical. More recently, I think, I think of barriers, I think of those classic barriers, which are the barriers of that we've already talked about. How do these laboratories understand what content should be developed? How should it be reported? Christine mentioned physician education. That's one route. Another route that we're working on now strategically are these, what we call enterprise medication safety management programs. These are payer-based initiatives where we're really looking at things like pre-population analysis and how we identify at-risk subpopulations within a group. How do we develop ROI models around the cost of not implementing a program and what we measure from the standpoint of not just the ADR itself, but the longitudinal cost of that ADR? And then how do we look at implementation of that program and the metrics around it? So the barriers for the first model can be things like physician education. They can be the barriers we've already talked about. In the second model, in these enterprise programs, the barriers really are, what types of large-scale health economic studies are available that we can point payers to? How do we, when we think about self-insured employer segments, how do we understand the return models for, say, an aging population that's in multiple medications versus a working well population that might be experiencing their first medication? So the barriers are very different when you think about these different models of deployment.
Seems like there's a misconception sometime that by standardizing or minimizing the variation in specific aspects of the delivery of PGX, that people are going to lose what's unique about their business, or some people might lose, some sort of either cachet or things that maybe they used to stand out earlier. Maybe you guys could speak to or dispel that misconception as it relates to the work that we're trying to do in the community.
Oh, can I go ahead with that one?
Yeah.
I just got to jump in on this because there's a biz dev component to this that I think is worthwhile. When you roll back to, I think, the most prolific year in the US of testing, which was 2014, and you look at several million, maybe 5 million or more tests that were deployed across different technology providers. I mean, that was a fraction. That was with less than, say, maybe 3% or even less. Christine may have a better number here, of physicians that were aware enough to actually prescribe the test or order the test. When you look at the number of, say, SSRI prescriptions written in a given year or prescriptions for statins, I mean, I think that you can worry about non-uniqueness, or you worry about uniqueness, I think, when the market is relatively small and you're playing among a small number of against a smaller number of laboratories. And this sounds a bit more strategic, but I can't help but kind of describe it for the way I see it. I think by standardizing, if you looked at the actual market potential for testing and the need, then that uniqueness is less of a worry, and it's a pure capacity model, in my view.
Yeah, I think there have been, I agree completely. And part of the question about standardization is, what is the panel, right?
Yeah.
So as far as publications go on pharmacogenomics, there have been dozens, hundreds on a single gene companion diagnostic for a single drug. And it's been spoken of several times today, but I'm really glad you figured out that, say, my clopidogrel is not going to be effective in me, and I would prefer to not restenose, so I'd like to get prasugrel. But what about the fact that I'm depressed by that, so now I'm taking an antidepressant and you haven't tested me for that? Or I happen to have kidney disease and I'm taking these 3 drugs, or I have, whatever. And so the idea of standardization to remove non-uniqueness is actually all in the interest of improving patient outcomes. And so full disclosure, as I mentioned, I grew up in a Canadian medical system, so I don't think of the financial outcomes, but from the financial outcomes standpoint, a hospital who provides better care in what is quickly emerging as a value-based care initiative in the United States, that hospital will be the preferred provider by showing they have lower 30-day readmits and ED visits and everything else. So from the other thing that we can do as a community is to foster those studies that will prove that this breadth approach will provide improved outcomes. That curries favor with the FDA and with central medical services, with payers, but also with patients, right? Patients want to see systems where they're going to be healthier.
To extend on what Burns says, I think one of the committees really aligning the studies that are needed in the space. This whole, hey, we do this study, you do that study, you do that study, they're great. But what health systems and providers are trained to see is like a replication of the same kind of study over and over again to believe the conclusion. And so the more we as an industry can align those studies so that we can point to, look, this worked at Christ, look, this worked at Mayo, look, this worked at, and just replicate wherever we can similar studies or similar methodologies so that we're proving the point to move the entire industry forward and not just a panel that's focused on a single disease state. To Jamie's point, when the tide rises, so do all boats, right?
I would add, just the last market comment is that in that most prolific testing year, we barely kept up with the birth rate. There's 300 million more of us. So this idea that somehow, uniqueness would, the lack of uniqueness would somehow eliminate demand or would limit demand, I think is wholly false. I think standardization allows a much better platform for deployment. And that's what labs need, a stable platform for deployment.
Guys, I'd like to use this opportunity as we're close to wrapping up here to ask each of you, what would you say to the precision medicine leaders who are meeting today as part of this summit, who are now trying to decide if they should register and participate in the Stripe community?
Giddy up.
Yeah. If you're not going to participate, I think it's going to be hard to have a voice otherwise. It's a great opportunity. It's going to be a tremendous amount of work, and we need all the help we can get. And I think if you're strongly opinionated and if this space is important to you, then participating is the way to get your voice heard.
Yeah, I would echo that. Please join. I think after 20 years in the space, it feels like go time. We're reaching a tipping point right now, and you can either participate and be part of that tipping point and make your voice heard in that effort, or it's not going to be included. And I think we need all of the people in the precision medicine community that are willing to participate. So please join us.
I would agree. I would agree, and I would just echo, at this point in our national politics, it's time for all of us to come together. Everyone has their own ideas of what's right and what's wrong, but if we don't all get in the room together and have a collective decision on how we move forward, we really can't be heard. So the more voices we have, the better. And it's really important for us to get input from all sides, because we have our interests and the interest of the patient at heart. Payers have their own interests, labs have their own interests. And if we can get all of those people in the room under one tent so that we can come up with a collective decision process that, as was mentioned, rises all boats, that's the best opportunity that we have. So I really hope that people will continue to join the community so that our voice will be heard, not only at the FDA or at CMS, but down to the level of the patients.
Thank you, Burns. Sarah, how easy is it to get signed up? Where do people go? What steps can they take today and right now to get dialed in and plugged into the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually is pretty seamless to sign up, and just want to kind of make sure everyone knows that Stripe was developed to be an all-inclusive platform, and we do encourage all stakeholders in pharmacogenetics testing to register to participate. And really, you just go to the ASP website, stopadr.org/Stripe, and there's a registration form. There's no cost to participate. And then after you register, you will get an email to review the Stripe charter. And after you sign the Stripe charter, you are a member. You will get to come to all of the Stripe quarterly meetings. For all members, there's subcommittees that we're actively developing, and and I know bandwidth is definitely an issue for some people, but at least you'll be made aware of opportunities to participate as they arise. So we definitely would love to have all of you register. We do have a booth at the exhibit with a direct link to our website, so feel free to pop in, and we'll see you there.
We've got a few questions that have been posed by the audience, and I'll throw those out there, and whoever wants to take a stab is very welcome to do so. And I think, Burns, you may have touched on this a little bit, but is there a collaborative community that includes patients as well?
Absolutely. So what's unique about Stripe is there's over 9 different pathways for participation, and depending on the amount of time, effort and energy you want to invest in your participation, we have a pathway for you. Not only at the steering committee level, so at the leadership level of our organization, where we've slated seats for patient advocacy organizations so that they and the groups they represent can have a seat at the table. But we also have a specific pathway for participation with the patient advocacy, equity, and inclusiveness subcommittee that would allow a whole diversity of patient representativeness in the community. So we have at least 2 different ways that each of those organizations and patients would be actively integrated and integral in the development of the community.
Excellent, that's great to hear. How do you ensure privacy and security for patients on the databases? And how do you incentivize physicians to use such databases unless EHRs are hardwired to the database?
So I guess it's an interesting question of to what database you refer. So for example, at the Christ Hospital, it's part of your EHR, it's part of Epic. So that has all of the assurances that Epic has for protecting patient data and also sharing patient data with patients through things like MyChart. So if you're talking about the patient database with the providers in our system, and I think in many systems, it's incorporated into the electronic health record. In other laboratory approaches and other systems, it happens through a PDF, which I think is very secure because nobody's going to go through and search through that anyway. and then as far as the database, for example, that Christine was mentioning, that Invitae is the #1 contributor to ClinVar, the clinical variant database. Those are de-identified patient data that then allow us to track outcomes and come up with potentially new genes that are impacted. So I guess I'll defer to my other colleagues to address what other databases are, but from just a single patient standpoint in a hospital system, the electronic medical record is where I think discrete data should always live. And all of our precision medicine initiatives require people to incorporate with Epic, because we don't want to be dealing with outside databases.
I will say that the Invitae clinical decision support tool UScript, and I know other clinical decision support tools in pharmacogenomics that integrate into Epic, Cerner, Allscripts. There's a pretty exhaustive security process you have to go through, both to become a EHR approved application, as well as to make it through health systems 7,000 page questionnaires on security and IT. So anybody that's actually operating at the enterprise system with both external and internal databases, Invitae, clearly we processed over 1 million genetic tests. We have a lot of security in place to make sure that that's only shared in the amount appropriate when appropriate. I think it is very important to keep track and monitor those standards and continually evolve as you're able. But I would say people are doing the best they can to make sure that that information is as secure as possible without putting it behind a genetic exceptionalism firewall. I think I was on a panel with Heidi Rehm the other day, and she talked about how hard it was for her to actually get at the genetic information to make it useful in her health system. So, we shouldn't have these extra special rules for privacy and protection, over and beyond other information for patients that should also be secure and protected.
Excellent, thanks, Christine. Probably got time for one more question here. And it's, should newborn babies be tested using pharmacogenomics at birth, like testing for PKU?
It's a great question. I think it was mentioned earlier in the symposium that maybe starting at 2 years old. So I think that would be a great lofty goal for the future. Mm-hmm. But when we're not even keeping up with birth rate and number of tests that we do, mm-hmm. I think we have a long way to go. So I think wonderful goal for the future, but right now, probably save the infant testing for those who are receiving potentially risky drugs. Yeah. Christine or Jamie, I welcome your input.
I'd say a NICU, yes, but we're a ways away from, to your point, using the capacity we do have. I'd say we want to focus where we're going to be able to provide the most benefit as we ramp up the ability to scale and make it accessible. The other thing is, not to get too geeky, but your cytochromes express at different times as you develop, and so you don't reach the same cytochrome expression, and I think until you're like 13 or 14. And so there's a bunch of extra stuff that needs to be taken into account in the pediatric population.
We've had a number of initiatives with newborn screening sites across the US, and of course there's interest there, but I think as was mentioned, it's a question of timing and appropriateness. It's not easy to get newborn screens added, and certainly cost is a huge factor in newborn screening, and so we're a ways away from